We shall no like the Naboo.
We shall march with the Separatist droid army on feed.
Give immediately emergency powers to the Supreme Chancellor.
What's up, Meta Nerds? This video will take everything from canon and legends material to completely understand the Gungan species. From their homeworld, biology, history, culture, major locations like the mysterious holy sites of the Elders, which were either gods or reptilian aliens. We'll break down the magical Otoh Gunga city and see the Gungans' impact on the galaxy at large. Their story begins at grid coordinates 017 in the mid-rim, within the Chamel sector. A sector with 36 star systems, over 300 million barren stars, and 40,000 settled dependencies. Just think that all of them are represented by Jar Jar Binks in the Imperial Senate for a brief time after Padme's death. The Naboo system had a single sun and 6 orbits, the first being a searing rock world of Moth, followed by Erep with a similar composition and 1 moon, then Naboo and its 3 moons. Next was the lifeless rock Widow, the aptly named gas giant Storm with 32 moons, and lastly the world covered in acid rivers, Bepor. All these moons and lifeless worlds would later prove difficult for the Naboo royal forces to patrol, and this system and space just outside this system would be filled with pirate outposts, both big and small, being a nice resting spot between the core and outer rim. Naboo itself had a 26-hour day, 312 days in a year, 12,120 kilometer diameter, and Type 1 atmosphere, making it all very similar to Coruscant before it was covered in Durasteel. Naboo would forever pride itself on their ability to preserve the beauty of the rolling hills, forests, mountains, swamps, and oceans, and a lot of Gungan blood went into keeping it this way. This lush world would give rise to countless forms of flora and fauna. Bubble Spore was a fast-growing water plant that could be boiled and turned into a plasma jelly-looking material used to build the cities like Otoh Gunga, as well as be the casing for the energy ball Boombas, the blue plasma from the ocean core being forced into this shell. Hornweed was a wood-like material used in bows and catapults, and if you look close you can see that Otoh Gunga sits on a limb of a massive underwater tree. This is a low-cap plant, and the roots of the low-cap pull up plasma like water, and by the time it comes out of the bulb it is safe to work with, and even eat for some ailments. Just look out for those spiny teeth on the buds that would close at any sign of harvesting. But this plasma was precious enough that the Gungans eventually developed ways to safely harvest this in enormous quantities, using it for energy, and so these people are like the Wookiee in that they live in enormous trees, and having most of their materials constructed from plants, while also living on something like an organic oil rig, pulling up their fuel used to power everything. This incredibly diverse life had all sorts of plants only found on Naboo that were prized in perfumes, medicines, and poisons, which is in part what drew those smugglers and assassins from all across the galaxy. It may have influenced Dr. Nuvo Vindi to put his experimental CIS biowarfare lab on Naboo. Though the Blue Shadow virus was not found here, it could have been useful to have access to so many other resources, and he may have been working on much more than just this single virus. Just like humans, the Gungan evolved in a world surrounded by beasts with much more powerful weapons and defensive capabilities, so the only way these relatively weak and small creatures rose to dominate their surrounding was due to their greater intellect. Crafting weapons and domesticating some animals like the Blarth, an amphibious, tusked dog-like creature, and Graysaur, which were loved by the humans on this world as well. Cerebors were beasts of burden and battering rams due to their thick skulls, as were Gwalar. Burses were like bears that could decimate entire Gungan civilizations, and though some Gungans did capture newborns and try to domesticate them, by their later history they were thought essentially extinct after the Gungan Grand Army systematically hunted them. These creatures were always a threat, but the push to extinction was prompted by off-world mercenaries that were using them as bioweapons, clans of Burses near Gungan surface cities, slaughtering thousands, and leaving no trace of foul play. Human Naboo officials just writing this off as the natural risk of swamp dwelling, as there were no blasters or bombs used in this warfare. Galloomps were less deadly but would also tear up enormous areas of vegetation like a boar. Aquana, which were enormous octopus-like creatures that used air balloons to rise and sink, so in the era of advanced weaponry they would be mounted with remote firing weapons and steered almost like living zeppelins. Dunsen were like fish, but at some point they evolved to float in the atmosphere, and were called flop carriers as the Gungans attached their underside for a troop transport. While a popular mount was the Felumpaset, it was related to the Terrazod, which dunked its head and foraged the swamps, while larger mounts were the Fambas, reaching 5 meters tall. Cappers were giant murder moths, and the flute was a predatory butterfly. There were tons of spiders, and clodhoppers, which were horrifying flightless birds that produced like bugs. They could spawn 200 young in just 2 days, and spent every waking minute devouring. They were eaten by just about everything else, including Gungans, who swore these things made for a tasty beef jerky-like snack. The beautiful pico birds would snatch up eggs from the mindless killing monsters the fanback, and though smaller, the fanner rolls would kill you without making a sound. The seas were dominated by the Opie sea killer, Kolo clawfish, and Sando aqua monster, and of course, thousands of fish species. Perhaps the most fascinating case is of the Glurgs. They have similar attributes to the Gungans, but these bipeds are said to be no more intelligent than a wild animal, yet could be trained to do everything from farming, construction, fishing, hunting, and even mining. They barely ate anything, were strong and peaceful, but the fact that they were bipedal, laboring amphibians, it was like if humans trained other primates as workers. Supposedly, they were all treated well, and it's said that this is not a form of slavery. They swear they are not like other sentient alien species, but the fact that they could carry out so many complicated tasks made this relationship unlike any other in the galaxy. But again, they never revolted or showed any discomfort with their position in society. This list of creatures is nowhere near comprehensive. There's a ton more about Naboo wildlife and other planets in the field guide. After millennia of evolutionary competition alongside all that, the modern Gungan would stand 1.9 meters or 6 foot 3 inches, taller than most humanoids, with an average lifespan of 65 years, and you'll see two types, the Ankura and Otola, which are considered different Gungan races, with the Ankura being green-skinned and the Otola being the orange and purple. They both had these long ears, but the Ankura style was to tie them together behind their head, and they had wider heads and eyes that were more like a human, inside the skull and not on retractable stalks like we see with Jar Jar. Everything else about them is the same biologically, and it is believed that the differences is the result of the Ankura dwelling more on land, losing some of the more water-optimized physiology. They started life as tadpoles, emerging from their water cradles made in the mud and grass. Nictitating membranes would cover their eyes when underwater, while their flexible, cartilaginous skeleton, having no bones, combined with powerful muscles to allow them to frog-kick swim their way into the deep, using their hard bills to dig into the mud, and long tongues to grab and pull up plants and animals. Ears were used to express emotion and communicate without sounds during hunts, and the lighter skin colors were seen as more attractive, perhaps because whatever the shade was, they all grew darker with age, and elderly Gungans like Tarpals did sport some prominent whiskers. The Gungan nostrils were covered in a sealing goo when they went underwater, and they could not breathe underwater but did have enormous compound lungs that were efficient enough to allow them to have oxygen for what appears to be hours, though no official time has been confirmed. A combo of sharp and rounded teeth allowed them to crack into shellfish and grind down gumballs and plants. Most of their early societies promoted living in harmony with nature, treating their domesticated beasts well, and having a particular connection to the Kadu. Like the Tuskens and their banthas, a specific Kadu was tied to an individual Gungan, having funeral ceremonies when one died, which were on par of the level of a family member. The official term used is Gungan alpha males, to describe those war-loving, aggressive Gungans that were known to exhibit a series of clicks when angered, and these males mostly made up their volunteer military throughout their history, with the most prominent having a Kadu and being skilled at using it in warfare. These militia gung would often go to schools dedicated to strengthening this bond and increasing their proficiency with weapons. Their original language is now called Old Gungan, which is the source of those non-basic based words spoken in Gunganese. This Gunganese is mostly just altered versions of basic words, while there are things like Bombad which are still mixed in. There is a sort of Rosetta Stone in the Gung slabs, a series of monoliths that have Oles Corellisi, or Old Corellian on one side, and Old Gungan on the other. The Old Corellian means that this had to be created around 20,000 to 4,000 BBY, and shows that this mid-rim world along the Enarch Run and Old Trade Federation trade route was visited by alien species with some regularity, including those with powers in the dark side, with at least one Gungan Sith confirmed during the Old Republic era. We can assume that their original word for their gods is lost, as it sounds too much like basic, as the Gunganese word is good. The Goods lived in a deep underwater city of Osorus, protected by aqua monsters and giant Kadu riding warriors. Some were good goods, like Dobis, the rain goddess, while Mechamok was a master of destruction. There was the trickster Nododo, and Lord of War, Balaam, who once was a living Gungan, the first great warrior who was so powerful that the Goods granted him immortality. While the boss or king of Osorus was Oma Oma, the goddess that created all life and guided the beneficial gods to provide for the Nabooians, while also fighting off the evil Goods. Gungan priests taught that anyone could prove themselves worthy enough to become a god with Oma Oma's command, if they could master something as well as Balaam had, as that Gungan turned god was chosen by Oma Oma specifically to train the other gods to fight against Mechamok, who had set about promoting death and decay on Naboo. There are many statues of the gods in the Gungan sacred places, enormous statues seen all over Naboo, but again we see a sad loss of their original traditions. Gungans themselves would see a distant prehistory only recording battles with Veermoks during a Naboo ice age, but then no record until they were invaded by the spacefaring reptilian humanoids with a powerful force connection called the Elders. These technologically superior people pushed the Gungans to live underwater, and during this rule, humans arrived from the core world of Griswold, circa 4000 BBY. It is unclear why the humans were not wiped out, but they established several cities, and named this world Naboo after their god of writing, Naboo. Again, the Gungan word for their homeworld is lost, and after centuries passed, these enormous statues and the powerful culture that built them was equated with the gods. The holy sites were the abandoned creations of the Elders. But it might not be the case that they worshipped the face of their oppressors. Notice that they look more human than reptile, not really fitting the Elder description, so some researchers believe that these were representations of the Elders' gods, not just of themselves or their powerful leaders. And I would add that perhaps in their connection to the Force, they discovered the entities that ruled over Naboo. Like angelic or demonic principalities assigned to certain areas, perhaps there is a similar order from the Ones, the human-looking Force gods seen on Mortis. Maybe this all explains why the human settlers were not hunted by the Elders. To add to the mystery, neither human nor Gungan historians fully understand why the Elders left. Both civilizations agree that they must have been forced to leave due to their disrespect to nature. If the goods really are some Naboo-based Force deities, this could be an interesting dynamic as the Elders were so strongly connected in the Force, and really could have been attacked by these deities for their transgressions. Though some posit they were chased off by some other alien army, that the Elders may have been hiding out on Naboo after fleeing across the galaxy. There may be a whole separate ancient fight between two orders of the Force, like Jedi hunting Sith remnants to extinction across multiple planets. These evil, Force-wielding reptilians may be being hunted by their own light side rivals. Please comment any ideas this sparked, or your own personal headcanon on this. I really find this fascinating and hope it gets explored more in the future. But sadly, in this power vacuum left once the Elders fled, the War of the Gungan tribes ignited in 3000 BBY. Many Gungan tribes are always at war with each other, with each being like city-states with a shared Gungan culture, but still identifying with their city against everyone else. With the exception of Boss Gallo, who was one of the few who tried to mediate and run a peaceful city of Otoh Sanctur. On the day of the sacred feast, Gallo went out to perform his duty as boss.
Gallo, as is the custom of our peoples, user must go into the forest and find the beasts.
Misa will bring back many fine animals for the muncheon.
As he was in the wilderness, the city was attacked, and he knew only one Gungan was this evil.
Only the evil Gungan warlord Robo would send Bursas against his own people.
Boss Gallo would successfully unite the bosses from several different cities, calling their combined militia gungs the Gungan Grand Army. They were able to capture the warlord's city, Spearhead, a city which had never been conquered by another tribe in its entire history. Once they broke through the walls, they captured the surrounding forests, and Lake Poanga at its core. With the plasma flows that carved out caverns that connected the entire planet, this lake connected to all the major bodies of water across Naboo. Boss Gallo would found a new city here, calling it Otoh Gunga, or City for all the Gungans. All cities and even the separate Gungan races were now unified, with Otoh Gunga starting out on the outskirts of the lake, and then gradually more and more underwater, until it became one of the most beautiful hidden gems in the entire galaxy. The first bubbles made up what is now called the Ancient Quarter, and these bubbles are now dimmer and more fragile and permeable. These were likely ceremonial places, as Boss Gallo ruled a sacred city, and their gods lived in that underwater city. So Otoh Gunga was like the Gungans building their own Mount Olympus, where a temple meant to bring them closer to the boss good. The religious symbolism is clear, and the beauty reinforces this holy creation. It's also a technical marvel as well. These bubbles were created using powerful shield generators like you might find on a ship, here powered by the plasma from the core, which was harvested through that low-cap tree. The main bubble, called the City Big Space, sits on a branch, using that low cap for stability and easy harvesting. Bubble wort extract provides the catalyst to energize the plasma in the emitter, going out in this bubble shape and then attracted right back into itself to be constantly regenerated. This makes it incredibly efficient, long-lasting, and even had the ability to adjust the amounts of bubble wort used to create the bubbles, giving them different strengths and transparency. Private dwellings would be opaque, while most of these open spaces we see are left open to enjoy the beauty of the wildlife, as well as allowing ships to come and go. The larger the bubble, the more struts and Uta nodes were needed to help guide the bubble and keep it stable, with the largest having this Ker node on top. with City Big Space having the largest and most elaborate assembly, containing powerful air purifiers, and besides just its beauty, these larger bubbles would have tons of shops, restaurants, and some of the most ridiculously fun cantinas in the galaxy. All with no violence, just silly cut-loose partying. A culture that was kept lighthearted by their veneration for the martial traditions. The Gungans were able to balance peace, goodwill, love for nature and all living things with their ability to vanquish all who don't hold these values. Like the Gods, they were at constant war with chaos. The Festival of Warriors was one of their greatest holy days, and many were surprised to see these seemingly goofy, carefree people have such strict laws. Vandalism can get you exiled at best, though you could be taken up to the surface and stoned to death. They look at these exiles as reminders that all of society was just as fragile as an old bubble, and even if you were invited back after exile, most Gungans just saw you as a prop, pointing to you and chastising you publicly so that all others, especially the youth, would see firsthand the consequences of their actions. While on a larger scale, entire cities and some sections of cities could be exiled or choose to leave on their own after a dispute. There are a ton of other underwater cities that look like Otoh Gunga, and when they separate, many parts just float away and towards Otoh Gunga with hopes of being able to connect to the famous complex. Some are invited in, while others are banned outright, and still others are just waiting for a response. So just outside of this sprawling city, there are many rogue orbs just floating about. And in this era, we would see the first relationships with humans. In 2900 BBY, Regent Kalosuk hired Gungan mercenaries to protect his city, but over the years this practice died out. And though there wasn't fighting, the two species generally stayed away from each other. But there was always a decent amount of trade between the two. Even if in major cities like Theed, these traders that made their way into the swamps were always in the lower classes of society. In 2000 BBY, the human king, normally the explorer, wanted to colonize their swamp moon, Rory. He reached out to the Gungans to help in moving settlers from their people here as well, likely out of an understanding that much of their economy relied on goods and knowledge provided by the swamp people, and they did make for peaceful neighbors. Better to fill the lakes and swamps with them as opposed to pirates. The time of suffering would last from around 1032 BBY to 832 BBY, a human civil war where their city-states broke up and warred against each other. It is unclear if the Gungans got involved, though we could expect some war-loving exile cities not under Otoh Gunga rule to likely have thrown in with them. The human Jafan would prove victorious, making Theed the capital of Naboo, making himself king, and joining the Galactic Republic. They were latecomers to the galactic community, and the Jafan royal family would rule for the next 700 years, until the Gungan-Naboo War. This conflict would last nearly 3 decades, from 150 BBY to 121, and the last descendant of the Theed kings, the Jafan line, ended when Gungan forces killed him in combat. The powerful lords of Jafan's court voted on the next king, and this is how they picked up the practice of electing a king, the leader having the powers of a monarch, but to be renewed, not hereditary. Though there was a clause that they could elect a new dynasty, likely with the requirements of near complete agreement, not just a majority, and there were many in Queen Amidala's court that wanted her to push for this vote, and make Amidala the first dynasty since the Old Republic era. Though she refused, there were later queens that did entertain this thought. With the Gungan warriors proving so proficient they changed the human government, peace treaties were signed, but many powerful nobles and business leaders conspired to wipe out the swamp dwellers once and for all. Around 100 BBY, seemingly unconnected mercenary groups descended on the Gungan cities, waging countless small wars. The Gungans feared they would be completely wiped out, but this war had the effect of uniting them in greater ways than ever before, pumping out all sorts of new technology and producing warriors that were surely blessed by the gods. This clandestine war was not covered in any of the human media, though it was spoken about in the fine palaces of Theed. It was common knowledge that House Tapalo and House Varuna provided most of the funding, and that it ended up being less about the grudge from the last war, but just about the credits that could be made from tapping into the plasma reserves. The banking clan was trying to negotiate unprecedented mining operations on Naboo, and was courting the noble families of Theed. The most principled man on this planet, a noble who was truly noble, was the patriarch of House Palpatine. Kosinga Palpatine proudly told the Mune banking clan representative Higo Damask how his forefathers stood up to those traitors, those immoral cretins that would slaughter innocent Gungans and hope to sell off Naboo to the highest bidder.
When my grandfather learned of this, he challenged Tapalo's father to a duel of honor, and eventually succumbed to the injuries Tapalo's blade inflicted. He gestured to a lawn that bordered the veranda. The duel took place just there.
Ego Damask, with the secret identity of Darth Plagueis, was unfazed by this display, and would sense that the man's son, Sheev, did not embody this tradition of high morality that had defined House Palpatine. Damask Holdings would work with the Trade Federation to force open these plasma harvesting operations, with the obvious being the monetary benefit, while secretly being the first domino that would lead to the revenge of the Sith. The Battle of Naboo would see the Trade Federation's personal defense fleet put to invasion, setting down near Otoh Gunga, carelessly destroying everything in their path on their way to capture Theed. Their underwater city was unharmed, and the Jedi advisors that hoped to negotiate peace may have been the first Jedi to set foot in this magical place. The exile Jar Jar Binks was met with a typical response, but playing on their belief that the gods honored life debts, Jar Jar was sent off with the Jedi and they tried Bubble Bongo, using that cavernous superhighway to make it to Theed, but not before passing by the beasts that surely protected the City of the Goods. After Queen Padme Amidala revealed herself and bowed to a Gungan boss, something unprecedented in their thousands of years of sharing this planet, the invaders now faced a unified force.
We saw being friends.
And on the open fields, the Gungan Grand Army would come out in full force. Fambas would carry the deflector shield generators, blocking any fast-moving projectiles or ships, while many of the militia gungs carried their own personal shields as well. Weaponry came in the form of spears, atlatls, electropoles, and cestas to throw those boombas, while the Gungan battle wagon were mobile catapults attached to the Falumpa sets, launching larger boombas, while others carried extra ammo. Raptors could have been used for their anti-aircraft capabilities, while if the battle went underwater we would have seen the war bongos. Like those warriors of old, Kadu were still a staple, used by officers to coordinate forces, while having entire cavalry that would at times use flamethrowers. And though the droid army was able to pass through, the exile, and totally not descendant of the Sith Gungan from the Old Republic era, would take out several droids with a drunky monkin fight style. But eventually the droids did surround the Grand Army and force them to drop their weapons. Only the actions of the Chosen One above saved the day. And with the Gungans being valued allies, the next decade would be a great time of peace for all Nabooans, with Boss Nass invited to the Freedom Day Parade, lifting the globe of peace to symbolize this union. This parade was 2 days after the battle, and Padme worried that it was in bad taste, that it should be a public mourning for the death of Qui-Gon Jinn. But Obi-Wan Kenobi convinced her that his master would have been greatly pleased to see this planet giving up centuries of animosity and embracing the path of peace. Most Gungan exiles would never regain the respect, but Jar Jar's great martial prowess gave him one of the greatest reversals of public opinion in all of galactic history, embraced by the boss, and sent off to proudly represent them in the Senate with their new human allies. Likely this would have softened the glares on the other exiles throughout Naboo. And while Naboo was riding high, the galaxy was in its most tumultuous decade in millennia, and even the Gungans that left Naboo found themselves caught up in the violence. Lawlessness and piracy was funded by Darth Plagueis, and when Gungans on their moons encountered ever-increasing enemies, they channeled their warrior god Balaam. Kenobi, R2, Amidala, and Jar Jar all worked to establish the Gungan colony of Oma Da'un to help solve some overpopulation issues on Naboo, and planted some colonies on Rori. These on Rori may have been from those exiled cities that either refused to or were rejected by Boss Nass, because they were violently against the Human-Gungan alliance. The way they saw it, Nass just wanted to make history, but was being played like a fool. That their treaty saw thousands of Gungans used as cannon fodder to slow down that droid force. And Queen Amidala was still Naboo's representative, and always would be seen as their betters in this human-dominated galactic culture. The way everyone else saw it, these Roar Gungans were extremists, known for killing anyone who approached their city.
He's just standing there, menacingly!
Though it did work because they would stay independent up through the end of the Imperial era, and as Captain Hask once said, if Yusa Tinkin Gungans need to be more warlike, Yusa come see me and bring weapons. If Yusa Tinkin Wisa Gungan should be saddled like Kadu, then Yusa come see me so I can spit on you. Ptuh. In 22 BBY, of all the species, it would be a Gungan that moved to give Supreme Chancellor Palpatine emergency powers, in order to construct an army for the first time in 1,000 years. Surely Balaam was smiling in his holy city. Galaxy-spanning tensions would erupt on Geonosis, and the Clone War had begun. While the Republic now had their own Grand Army, the Gungan military worked with their human allies to keep the Chamel sector free of separatist influences. And though they would never be taken over, they were targeted by bioweapons twice. The moon, Oma Da'un, was hit by a CIS bioweapon called swamp gas that killed off almost every single Gungan colonist. It was only a Jedi task force that kept this from being launched on Naboo. And then a year later, in 21 BBY, Dr. Vindy would have a secret lab on Naboo to develop the Blue Shadow virus, which, if released, could have killed all life on this lush world. And these attacks too close to home helped to make the Gungan and Republic Grand Armies work together on several missions, like when their aquatic ops proficiency was used to help free Mon Cala of Rift Tamsin's CIS forces. But the off-world Gungans weren't the only ones that harbored hatred towards the Naboo humans and Republic at large. There was an independent paramilitary group called the Ultra Gungans, which sounds worse than they might have been. They fought off droids during the Battle of Naboo, and most likely were never a part of the unified Gungan people under Boss Nass, like those exiled cities mentioned earlier. Of course, they were paramilitary, but they were para-everything. Para-economy, government, defense, all outside of the influences of the Naboo, the bosses, and especially the Republic. They would become a thorn in Boss Nass's side up through the Imperial era, but some, even in the major Gungan cities like Otoh Gunga, did have plenty of resentment that could be manipulated by Count Dooku. Richelieu sat on the Gungan High Council, the group that Jar Jar would also join after the Battle of Naboo, while also acting as the junior senator of Naboo. It was easy for Count Dooku to pry on this species' old grudges, pointing out that the true native species would represent Naboo in the Separatist Senate, and likely also appealed to Richelieu's want for power and credits. At this time, the boss was an Otoh Gungan named Leone, and seemingly out of nowhere, he wanted to plan an attack on Theed. Anakin, Padme, and Jar Jar rushed to meet with him, only to find that he was being mind-controlled via an odd necklace. This art is so esoteric that it never is recorded by offworlders, and may be of Old Gungan or Elder origins, with only this cryptic response by Jar Jar.
Ancient Gungan mystical power. Mind over matter.
After finding this puppet was free, Lu killed Leone and hurried to proclaim that the fallen leader's last wish was to move on Theed immediately. While he was interrupted, he did make an escape via speeder, leading Anakin Skywalker to be captured by Count Dooku. While General Tarpals realized Grievous was arriving with reinforcements personally to oversee this sacking of Naboo, Jar Jar would don the garb of the boss and stall long enough to allow the Gungan troops to disable the droid army. When the cyborg stormed out, the swamp dwellers swarmed. With their array of electro and plasma-based weaponry, this Kalish, one of the greatest warriors in the entire galaxy, was being slowed by this Gungan onslaught. General Tarpals went to end him. Being a cowardly cyborg at this point, he couldn't have foreseen this move.
Not die. Sacrifice!
This sacrifice would not end the war, but would save the Chosen One, the man who, as a child, had once saved Tarpals and the entire Gungan species. Shortly after Order 66, the Empire did have to crush a small rebellion in Theed.
Her newly elected queen broke off diplomatic ties and began exploring military options.
And some Gungans were known to be involved in this initial resistance, but they quickly realized that their time-honored strategy of laying low under the water was their only move.
With the queen eliminated, Naboo quickly fell in line. It was the first time the 501st was called upon to adjust a planet's government. But it wouldn't be the last.
And this did work. Once the darkness blew over, after the Battle of Endor, they rose up out of the lakes and joined their humans in pushing the Imperial remnant off completely, and they quickly reformed their unified Nabooan forces. In this time of the New Republic, more Gungans than ever decided to move into the galaxy at large, and colonies of them could be found from the core to the Outer Rim. So that's it for the breakdown. As for cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff, there was the Gungan male Sith cult member named Kosa Yenhadu, who left the Jedi Order in 33 BBY. He was Padawan to another Gungan Jedi named Kin Yadosun, and this Sith would work with a Mon Calamari Dark Jedi, joining the Believers, an ancient and hidden Force cult on the planet Almas, making for at least 2 powerful Sith Gungans. On the moon of Almas, there was a resort that was run by a bunch of Gungans, and they worked with Quarren engineers to produce all sorts of watercraft. There was the famous wrestler, the Mighty Mastoro, and even some Gungan mercs. And so since Mandalorians took in all sorts of species, there may have been Gungan Mandos, which must have sounded ridiculous when they were trying to sound tough. In 33 BBY, Chiss art collector and pirate by the name of Swag tried to steal Big Maxi Boss Garunda's statue, which was one of those elder/good statues. The population of Otoh Gunga is said to be around 1 million, and when the Gungan moon colonies were established, they used a Kresh, a semi-sentient mollusk that could form pictures on its skin as a sort of encyclopedia, with all kinds of useful info to start a colony. There's a ton of references to Earth gods and mythologies, with the Sidiosaurus sounding like Osiris while being like Mount Olympus. As humans see mountaintops as far off and inaccessible, these amphibians imagine that something far deeper in the water was just out of their reach. Even the name Naboo comes from Naboo, the Akkadian god of literacy and wisdom, while the Gungan war god Balaam is spelt a lot like biblical Balaam, a non-Israelite prophet that talked to God but looked to hurt the Israelites, being called a true prophet but a wicked prophet. Some of the early art for them was used to create the Glurgs, and here is ridiculous concept art for Jar Jar. The Gungan species being based on the hadrosaurs, and the name Gungan can refer to a genus of Australian frogs. But Lucas said the name actually came from his son Jet, who would point to and call tractors and trucks Gungans. The mythological guardians of the City of the Gods were said to ride on Kadu. Kadu can swim underwater, and we actually see this in Season 4, Episode 4. I did want to note that Gungan intelligence seems low, which I know might seem obvious, but that's really just because we're making fun of Jar Jar, but there is a lot of evidence towards them being kinda dumb. Jar Jar mentions mystical mind over matter practices, but Qui-Gon easily influences Boss Nass, and Leone was so easily controlled by this necklace. Combine that with Jar Jar citing that he was intelligent by pointing out that he could speak.
You almost got us killed. Are you brainless?
I speak?
The ability to speak does not make you intelligent. Now get out of here.
And we have to wonder about the Glurg workers, which we are told are definitely not intelligent creatures, so we should question if that's true. And we also have Boss Nass's main complaint being this.
We sound no like the Naboo. Naboo think they so smarty. They think their brains so big.
They were at least aware that others thought they were dumb, and they definitely have an odd interpretation of intelligence at best, most things pointing to them having a general lower intelligence than the general human population. Which isn't all that shocking, as there are species like the Chiss, which seem to be on average smarter than humans, and things like force powers do show greater expression in different species, so it should be expected that the IQ variable would differ across sentient species as well. I also wanted to point out this.
Gungans no dying without a fight. We say warriors. We say got a grand army. That's why you no liking us, Mr. Dinks.
Not only is this an interesting point on the takeaway of the movie, that the philosopher, artsy, pacifist place needs a military, and also that the Gungans can't just keep their heads in the sand, or underwater, and that the best is to unify these two cultures, both of which appreciating beauty, peace, and harmony with nature, just one naively idealistic, and the other naively isolationist. But note that she doesn't respond to this statement, either because she knows that she can't make the military bad defense after being chased off her own world, and or she can't say no, that's not why, we just think you guys are a dumb, crude people, with motorboat laughter and having those that vandalize be stoned to death. A lot of this info comes from the Atlas, Guide to Species, Field Guide, Complete Locations, and Cross-Sections books, as well as the Plagueis novel. Throughout this series, you'll hear a lot of clips from audiobooks, all brought to us by Audible, the sponsor of this video. Now is a great time to use the 1-month free trial to pick up some of the greatest Star Wars material ever produced. From Legends classics that stretch back to the time of the Old Republic with Revan and Bane, Republic and Clone Wars era essentials like Plagueis and Shatterpoint, or post-Endor and into the New Republic era with the original Thrawn trilogy. All on Audible with countless other Legends titles, and of course all the new canon stuff as well. The audiobooks with the excellent narration and ambient sounds really bring you into the story, and allow for much more unique experiences, and deeper lore than things like shows and movies can provide. Sign up today to receive 1 month free, giving you access to their entire Plus catalog, containing everything from podcasts, fitness, meditation, and sleep aids, on top of their library of thousands of audiobooks from every subject you can think of. If you love it like I do and stay on past the free trial, every month you get 1 credit to put towards any title you want. You can listen on PC or mobile, with great features like bookmarking and note-taking, and all your credits roll over if you don't use them. You keep these credits even if you cancel, and all titles that you pick up are yours to keep forever. I've been a paying customer of Audible for around a decade now, and new members can try Audible for free for 30 days. Visit audible.com/metanerds, or text metanerds to 500-500. If you made it this far, please hit that like button. It's the best way to help me out, as well as leaving a comment or sharing. Subscribe if you want to see more, and check out the links down in the description for free stuff and discounts. Special shout out to our patrons. And remember, just cause of they lookin' a silly, doesn't mean that they aren't hoping to be the next warrior god Gungan. And the force will be with you. Always.